Our topic this evening is Philo of Alexandria and the idea of the logos. And this is a very interesting topic, I think, because this gives a background within Hellenistic Judaism for the theological concept that's underpinning that Hellenized Jews who become then Hellenized Christians, in other words, the synthesis of Judaism and Greek philosophy, Greek theology that becomes the largely Greek-speaking Christian church. We notice sometimes that already that there is a very high Christology really early on, and one of the reasons why that's possible is that a lot of these theological ideas were already running around and contemporary even to the historical Jesus. So the fourth gospel in the Christian New Testament, what we now call the Gospel of John, it was actually an anonymous work when it was written, but now it's attributed to John. The fourth gospel begins with an early Christian hymn, which most scholars believe predates even the gospel. So it's sometimes called the Logos hymn or the hymn to the Logos. This hymn is a retelling of the first verses of the creation story that is very familiar from the beginning of the book of Genesis. And this retelling, though, in the Gospel of John has an emphasis on the presence of God's Logos in the creation. And we have here from a medieval French manuscript an image of the creation. We can see God as architect here holding an architect's compass and creating the cosmos, which is sphere-shaped, as everybody in the Middle Ages knew. So in Genesis 1 through 3, we read, "When God began to create the heavens and the earth was complete chaos, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." So this is probably more familiar in the King James, like, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," but this is the New Revised Standard Version updated edition. So in this familiar narrative, creation begins with God speaking, and thus God's words are present with God in the creation, as God says, "Let there be light." But the idea of that is made much more explicit in its retelling at the beginning of the Gospel of John. In that version we read, "In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. He," the Logos that is, "was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, without the Logos, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overtake it." So here, God's Logos, which is usually translated as God's Word, but obviously the word here has a lot more meaning than that, and that's what the topic of tonight's lecture is. God's Logos is present with God at the creation. And you can see here the relationship with the words that God speaks in Genesis, "Let there be light," because in him, that is to say, in the Logos was life. The life was the light of all people. Light shines in the darkness. So there's the equation here also of the words with light and true light. So there's already a lot going on here. We can see that the Logos is the agent of the process of creation. So the hymn says, "All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being." And we also see that the Logos has personal pronouns. It's being called he and him, rather than an impersonal idea of God's Word being it. And the Logos is both said to be with God in creation, and yet the Logos also is God. And so we already, even if when this was written, the doctrine of the Trinity had not been developed and fleshed out yet, nevertheless, there's already some kind of complexity here, understanding, again, with the understanding of the Logos as God and also as being with God. This is another medieval image mosaic from Northern Sicily from the 12th century of God in creation. The Logos hymn continues. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. So there's not going to be the group that are now going to be called children of God. They're not from any particular ethnicity, but they are all who are coming to know and believing in the name of the Logos coming into the world. And the Logos became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is the only Son, himself God, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him, the Father, known. So this is a very theologically thick, just a couple of verses, this hymn of the Logos, which is explaining this early Christian movement's understanding of itself as a different kind of community than the community that had emerged from in Second Temple Judaism. And it also, by the end of the hymn, obviously we've revealed that the Logos, which was the true light present with God at creation, that has come into the world, has become incarnate as Jesus Christ, has come to his own people, his people rejected him, according to this hymn. And then also, that Logos is God's only Son, and yet somehow is also himself God. So, where did it say that? It is the only Son, himself God, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made the Father known. So, God the Father. So no one has seen God the Father, only through the Son. So that statement, no one has ever seen God, seems to contradict passages in the Hebrew Bible. For example, in the book of Exodus, chapter 33, which is one of the sources, one of the parts of the Pentateuch, parts of the Torah, which is a Yahwist or a J-source passage. And so one of the characteristics of the Yahwist is having a much more fleshy human God who's more interactive with people than the priestly source, which wrote the beginning of the creation story, where God is much more cosmic and removed. And so in Exodus here, we read, when Moses entered the tent, the tabernacle that they used to travel around as the substitute for a temple, where the Ark of the Covenant is kept during the wandering in the wilderness. When Moses entered that tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and Yahweh would speak with Moses. And when all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, all the people would rise and bow down, all of them at the entrance of their tent. Thus, Yahweh used to speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. So this kind of seems to contradict this idea that in the present in the Gospel of John that no one has ever seen God. So how do we reconcile that? By the time the Logos hymn was written, a tradition had developed in Second Temple Judaism where God's name, Yahweh, written out with the tetragrammaton, the 4 letters, YHWH, is how we do it in English, would no longer be said aloud. And instead, when you would get to that place where in the text it previously had said Yahweh, now what you would have instead is you would say it, you wouldn't read it out loud, you would say instead, the Lord. And so, when the pillar of cloud would descend, the Lord would speak with Moses, and thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face. So there is a little bit step of remove here, as God's name is no longer spoken, and instead we're talking about the Lord speaking to Moses. So the Logos hymn has taken the idea of substituting the words, the Lord, for Yahweh one step further. Since no one has ever seen the unknowable, invisible Father, Moses must have been interacting with the Lord, and this is now theologically understood in early Christianity to mean with God's Logos, that is to say, with God's only Son, the pre-existent Christ. So Christ hasn't been born into the world yet, but nevertheless, as God has existed, before time even started to exist, and so therefore is interacting with, is the component of God that is interacting with people, as opposed to the unknowable source, the God the Father. And so this understanding, anyway, corresponds with the Apostle Paul's formula, where Paul's testimony is Christ is Lord. Christ is the Lord. So whenever we hear, we get to that part in the text where we say the Lord, then that refers to God's Word, God's glory, God's Logos, which is Christ, is the Christian understanding. And so this is why ancient and medieval artwork showing the creation is actually showing Christ rather than God the Father, who is not visible, because Christ, the world is created through Christ, and Christ is God's glory and God's Word made visible. And so you can see on the left especially, God here that is shown as the architect is wearing the red and blue robes of that are iconographic for Jesus, and you can see the halo has a cross behind it as well. It's less clear in the mosaic, but this is the idea. All of these early pictures of creation, unlike what happens in the Renaissance with Michelangelo's pictures of creation, these are understanding that the God the Father isn't to be depicted and isn't seeable, and instead we're looking at the Logos, the Christ. Christ is Christ before Christ was born into the world. So, like Paul then, the Logos hymn and the Gospel of John express a very high Christology, that is to say, an emphasis on Christ's divinity, and this contrasts with the much more human portrait of Jesus that's found in the Gospel of Mark, our first narrative gospel, where Jesus gets angry and shows a lot of emotions and acts a lot more human, more understandably human-like than Jesus acts in the Gospel of John. So much of the heavy theological lifting in John is accomplished by this understanding of Christ as God's Logos, which very clearly means much more than just the words, in a literal sense, that God speaks in Genesis, let there be light. So there is a bigger philosophical or theological concept here in using this term Logos than what we see immediately when we just read the hymn. So let's look at the term Logos. So while the ancient Greek word logos literally does mean word or discourse or perhaps meaning, already by the end of the first century of the Common Era, the Christian era, when the Gospel of John is written, the term had acquired a number of additional meanings, especially as a technical term in philosophy, Actually, different philosophers use the word to mean different things, but it's extremely important beginning as early as the works of Heraclitus. So Heraclitus of Ephesus, who was active around the year 500 before the Common Era, one of the earliest and most influential philosophers prior to Socrates. And so because of how important Socrates is, and especially Socrates' students, Plato, and then Plato's student Aristotle, for convention and for all of history, all of the philosophers before Socrates are called pre-Socratic. So Heraclitus wrote a long poem about nature called On Nature. Significant fragments, it's lost, but significant fragments survive because it was very influential, and so lots of later philosophers quote him. And one of the most famous quotes is the phrase, "One cannot step twice into the same river," which is a quotation from Heraclitus that's found in Plato. And so the idea of this, the idea is that, even though we, by convention, the river Thames is the same river that would have been called the River Thames in the Middle Ages, 1,000 years ago. Nevertheless, and it's in the same kind of place, it's not the same because it's constantly moving around, and the water is there's always different water. Everything has changed. It floods its banks and so on. And so Heraclitus is making the case that everything in the material world is in a constant state of change and flux, and therefore everything is always in the process of becoming something else. So, a seed is in the process of becoming a plant, which is in the process of becoming, a dead plant and a decayed plant and gone. And rather than anything actually having a state of being. And this is central then to Heraclitus' cosmology, his understanding of the world. Heraclitus uses the word logos to describe what he sees as the organizing principle central to his cosmology, central to his understanding of how the world is ordered. And so his poem begins with the statement, "Listening not to me, but to the logos is wise." Listening not to me, but to the logos, it is wise to agree that all things are one. And so he is going to then go on to describe how, even though everything seems to be opposites, they are actually ultimately part of the one and the same thing, because everything is in a state of change. So, like I say, this introduces his position that everything is in flux, but despite that, there's an underlying unity. So he says in another fragment, "Cool things become warm, warm things cool down, moist things dry out, parched things become damp, nothing stays the same under the sun." Of the logos, Heraclitus mourns, but of this principle which holds forever. So this is something that is beyond the one organizing principle, not all of the things that are of this earth that are in flux. The logos, of this principle, people prove ignorant, not only before they hear it, but also once they have heard it. So nobody's ever heard of this idea that he has before, but even once he tells people about it, they still are ignorant of it. For although everything happens in accordance with this principle, the logos, people resemble those with no familiarity with it, even after they have become familiar with the kinds of accounts and events I discuss as I distinguish each thing according to its nature and explain its constitution. You might remember that I told you that you never can step twice in the same river, but then you don't realize that that's because there's an underlying principle here, which is the logos, which you remain ignorant of. But while the general run of people are as unaware of their actions while they're awake as they are, but the general run of people are as unaware of their actions while awake as they are of what they do while asleep. So this kind of general ignorance of the public and lack of introspection, I think, is a common lament that philosophers continue to have all the way up into the present day. But Heraclitus is at least optimistic enough to insist in another fragment that everyone, he says, has the potential for self-knowledge and sound thinking if they would only exercise it. So again, of this logos, this underlying principle for everything, Heraclitus states, the one and only wise thing, the logos, this principle, exists and is not willing to be called by the name of Zeus. So this is kind of showing an idea that this organizing principle, this logos, this meaning, Heraclitus sees as sort of a divine being, and a divine being that is far superior in conception than the traditional religion that he finds around him, in other words, the gods and their king, Zeus. So Heraclitus, as we can kind of see, is also like a religious reformer. We sometimes in our post-Enlightenment, very modern attitude and worldview, we think of philosophy as like a secular pursuit separate from religion, because that's what ended up happening after the Enlightenment when philosophers were barred from control of the churches by clerics who wanted to maintain kind of control over their own thought and ideas. But in ancient times, part of what is happening in this whole tradition of philosophy is trying to make a kind of religious reform. So Heraclitus was dissatisfied with the traditional inherited religion of his day. That is to say, what we now call paganism, but this traditional religion, the worship of the gods that involved all sorts of appeasement rituals, making sure that the functioning of the universe continued to happen through the system of sacrifices and so on, things that people did out of habit and inheritance rather than because they had any particularly good or logical reason for doing any of those things. And so Heraclitus' work involved observing how the cosmos actually operates and how everything in it operates to the best of his ability, and then using reason to provide explanations. And so you can imagine why it makes sense that having had that as his own modus operandi and objective, that he comes to the conclusion that the universe actually is being operated by, there's a fundamental underlying principle of reason, of logos, that is actually the source or the operations. So rather than a cosmos that's ruled by chaotic human-like gods like Zeus, then Heraclitus argues that there is this single organizing principle that is a principle of reason that is the divine logos. So this is not in any way the only use of the word logos. And so I mentioned this one because Aristotle is so famous, and this connection that he makes of logos, pathos, and ethos, I think a lot of people will know, but this is a different path and using the word very differently. Aristotle himself was not a huge fan of Heraclitus' work. He also felt that as Heraclitus talked about all of these opposites sharing an underlying unity, he feels that actually is violating the principle of self-contradiction. So that's not what Heraclitus meant, but Aristotle decided to take him literally on that and say, well, that Heraclitus doesn't know what he's talking about. So Aristotle uses a different definition, or creates a different definition for logos as a technical term in his study of rhetoric. And so he says that there are three ways to make rhetorical arguments. You can either have ones that are logos, that is to say, a reasoned argument, which contrasts with pathos, which is making an emotional appeal, and then ethos, which is appealing to a person's sense of morality, right and wrong. And so the contemporaries, or the earlier contemporaries, the sophists, who were really good at public speaking and teaching rhetoric, also used the word logos to mean argument. But this isn't the use that continues on. It's not related to what Philo is using it for or what Christians are using it for, but I mention it because, again, it's complicated. There are more than one meanings. Zeno of Citium, who is Citium, I guess is the way we say it. Zeno of Citium is the founder of the Stoic school of philosophy, and he definitely did build on the works and ideas of Heraclitus. So the Stoics ultimately came up with a very elaborated cosmology, where they argued in their type of physics that the universe itself consists of a single living entity. So the world, the earth, and all of the spheres around it, all the planets and stars and everything, are themselves a coherent entity that's alive. And then within that entity, the entity is permeated by the logos, which is to say a divine rational principle that is having everything work together and function. We've done a couple of lectures on Stoicism, but it's always interesting to go back to. So as a result, this cosmology that they put together, Stoicism is a pantheistic philosophical religion, since the material universe is itself God and is a single cohesive unit. Nevertheless, the interior of the universe has parts, and the Stoics had a kind of a cosmic dualism, and they saw a division between this idea of logos, the active rational principle of God, and then the ousia, the substance, the passive principle of matter. So yes, all of the material world is part of, the cosmic God, but there's different parts. So that part that is actually, the kind of the rational, life-giving, active part that is putting everything together is the logos. And the logos then is therefore superior as the active principle to the passive material substance, the ousia. So, operating prior to Zeno and the Stoics, Plato had a more negative material world view of the material world than the Stoics later developed. For Plato, everything material is in that state of flux described by Heraclitus, which for Plato means that it exists now, but will eventually die or be destroyed. And so nothing in the material world is really important. It's a shadow of a true reality, because it's all going to be, coming out of being, coming into being and coming out of being. It's not going to be permanent. For this reason, for Plato, if you want to see something that's permanent, that's something that's everlasting, something that's truly real, it can't have a material component. It has to be entirely immaterial. And Plato comes to this by studying things like mathematics, and one of his other influences are the Pythagoreans, who are interested in all sorts of mathematical demonstrations. And this leads Plato to the idea that in addition to math and things like that, where you can have the idea of a perfect sphere, and that is that always will exist. There's always the idea of a perfect sphere, even if the world itself, which is a sphere, is not perfect. It's not perfectly spherical. So in that same way, there are all of these eternal ideas or forms that are imperishable but also immaterial, and that's what's truly real for Plato's philosophy. So Plato then develops a cosmology of his own, which includes the idea of oneness, which is to say the source of the forms, and therefore, obviously, as the greatest thing has to be immaterial. It's usually understood as the form of goodness, or goodness for goodness' own sake, in other words. And according to Plato in his dialogue, the Timaeus, the material universe is the creation of a lesser but fully benevolent divine being called the demiurge, which just means the artisan or the craftsman. And so this is not the same as the one, but is another divine being. And so although Plato doesn't use the word logos here to name either the one or the demiurge, his system is going to have an influence on Philo of Alexandria, especially as it gets later developed by Middle Platonists who are the contemporaries of Philo. And so you can imagine the one here is going to be able to be identified with the unknowable, invisible God the Father, and the demiurge with the craftsman of the created world, of creation, with the logos for Philo. So let's look at Philo of Alexandria with all of that background on what logos can already come to mean in ancient Greek philosophy. So Philo came from a very wealthy and very influential Hellenized Jewish family in Alexandria, Egypt. Philo's brother, Alexander, was the Roman customs agent, and Alexander was responsible for collecting the duties on all the imports that came into Alexandria from the eastern parts of the Roman Empire, which allowed him to become fabulously wealthy. Alexander, you can tell again here, this is a Hellenized family. They're not having names out of the Bible, but are rather being named after Alexander the Great. And Alexander wasn't a practicing Jew, unlike Philo. One of Philo's nephews married a daughter of Herod Agrippa, King Herod Agrippa I. So, in other words, the Herodian royal family is very prominent. Another of Philo's nephews became the Roman procurator of Judea in the 40s of the Common Era, so a couple times after Pilate, and later prefect of Egypt, so right before the Roman revolt. The first Roman Jewish War. Philo himself was a very respected leader in the very large Jewish community in Alexandria. And in the year 40 of the Common Era, Philo was elected to lead that community's delegation, as it had to plead a case before the Emperor Caligula himself. And so a very important, prominent, powerful Hellenized Jewish family. So Roman Alexandria was one of the great cities of the empire. It had previously was founded by Alexander the Great, but then, Alexander went out there, but it's founded by Ptolemy, his successor, and named for him, and becomes the capital of Ptolemaic Egypt, a great center of Hellenism. The Ptolemies founded a temple to the Muses, which are the goddesses of the arts and sciences, called the Museum. And that gives us our word for museum to this day. The museum also had its associated great library. And so under the Ptolemies, Alexandria displaced Athens as the center for Hellenistic philosophy. And continuing then after the conquest by the Romans, continued to be a cosmopolitan city, and perhaps had 400, 500,000 inhabitants, so making it one of the most populous cities in the empire after Rome itself, and also then with Antioch in Syria. Egypt was home to a very significant diaspora Judean community, beginning with the destruction of the kingdom of Judah, the kingdom of Judea and of Jerusalem by the Babylonians all the way back in the 6th century before the Common Era. The size of that Jewish diaspora community grew significantly under the Ptolemies, when more Jews lived in Alexandria than lived in Jerusalem. So again, there's hundreds of thousands of people in Alexandria. It's roughly divided into Greek-speaking, Greek and Macedonian population, alongside a local Egyptian population who over time also becomes Greek-speaking, and then finally a large population, a large Jewish diaspora population whose primary language also becomes Greek. According to the Greek geographer Strabo, writing at the end of the beginning of the end of the 1st century before the Common Era, beginning of the 1st century of the Common Era, Strabo says that the Jewish community in Alexandria enjoyed very substantial autonomy under the Ptolemies, and those privileges were maintained under the Roman administration. He says that the Jews have their own ethnarch, or archon, leader of an ethnicity, their own ethnarch who governs the people and adjudicates suits and supervises contracts and ordinances, just as if he were the head of a sovereign state. The ethnarch is able to operate just as if he were the head of a sovereign state, according to Strabo. Nevertheless, the Jewish community did not always get along with the Greek and Egyptian communities in Alexandria. So, for example, there were serious disturbances in the year 38. So when the Emperor Caligula came to the throne in the year 37, he sent his friend Herod Agrippa to Alexandria because he wanted to assess the loyalty of the prefect there, the person who had been loyal to the Emperor Tiberius and who hadn't seemed to have been a fan of Caligula, Aulus Avilius Flaccus. So this friend of Caligula's, Herod Agrippa, Caligula later restored as king. He made him king, restoring the kingdom of the kingdom of Judea as it had existed under Herod Agrippa's ancestor, Herod the Great. It previously had been administered for a long time as a Roman province, and Herodians were only able to rule little tiny territories of it as tetrarchs and so on. Now, under Caligula, Herod Agrippa is again made a king. But that's a couple years after this. So when Herod Agrippa came to Alexandria unannounced, the Greek community there really resented his presence because they saw him as the claimant to be the king of the Jews, and they didn't like having a direct representative of the emperor also representing the Jewish community. So the Roman prefect for Egypt, Flaccus, attempted to placate the local Greek community and also the emperor by ordering that all of the city's synagogues have statues of Caligula erected in them. And this is the kind of thing that Caligula liked, is having statues of himself put into temples and synagogues. But this was an unprecedented invasion of synagogues, which was resisted with force by the Jewish community in Alexandria. So according to Philo himself, when he writes about what happened, in response, the prefect Flaccus issued a notice in which he called us all foreigners and aliens. There's a community that had existed there for hundreds of years, allowing anyone who was inclined to proceed to exterminate the Jews as prisoners of war. So once that notice was in place, Philo says that mobs drove the Jews entirely out of 4 quarters of the city of Alexandria and then crammed them all into a very small portion of 1 quarter, while the non-Jewish populace then, overrunning the desolate houses of the Jews, turned to plunder and divided the booty among themselves as if they had obtained it from war. So Philo states that in some cases, whole families were burned to death in the resulting ethnic violence. And then just a couple years later, a second round of riots broke out between the Greek and Jewish communities in Alexandria in the year 40. The second round of riots resulted in those delegations from each of the communities being summoned to Rome to explain the cause of the dispute before the Emperor Caligula. And we have an account of that delegation. Philo talks about it himself, but we also have an account by Josephus, the Jewish Roman historian, writing in his book Jewish Antiquities. Josephus, as always, is a partisan, and he gives his own highly partisan account of this, but he also includes a description of Philo that's interesting. So Josephus says, "There was now a tumult arisen at Alexandria between the Jewish inhabitants and the Greeks, and 3 ambassadors were chosen out of each party that were at variance, who came to Gaius Caligula. Now, one of these ambassadors from the people of Alexandria was Apion." And so Apion is a Hellenized Egyptian who is also a teacher of rhetoric and a sophist who wrote commentaries on Homer, and he also wrote a collection of 5 books called the Egyptica, which talked about Egypt and included many slurs and attacks on the Jewish community there. So Apion was a big enemy of the Jewish community in Alexandria. The Egyptica is lost. But Apion uttered many blasphemies against the Jews, according to Josephus, and among other things, he said, he charged them with neglecting the honors that belonged to Caesar, for that while all who were subjects to the Roman Empire built altars and temples to Gaius Caligula, and in other regards universally received him as they received the gods, the Jews alone thought it a dishonorable thing for them to erect statues in honor of him, as well as to swear by his name. So many of these severe things were said by Apion, by which he hoped to provoke Gaius Caligula to anger at the Jews, as he was likely to be. So even though Josephus' description here says that these are lies, this is a problem. Jews, because of their monotheism and because of their, they are not to worship any other gods besides the God of Israel. They actually aren't able to easily worship the genius of the emperor or have statues of the emperor in their kind of iconoclastic synagogues, or especially in the temple in Jerusalem. So Josephus continues with a description of Philo. But Philo, the principal of the Jewish embassage, a man eminent on all counts, brother to Alexander the Alabarch, this is that official I was talking about who had control over the import duties in Alexandria, brother of Alexander, and one not unskillful in philosophy, was ready to betake himself to make his defense against the accusations. But Caligula prohibited him and bid him be gone. He was also in such a rage that it openly appeared that he was about to do some very great mischief. So the emperor did not even listen to the Jewish account. So Philo, being thus affronted, went out and said to those Jews who were about him that they should be of good courage, since Caligula's words indeed showed anger at them, but in reality had already set God against Caligula. So Josephus is writing this with the benefit of hindsight, and at the time that this delegation failed, Philo, of course, wouldn't have known that Caligula was about to be assassinated the following year, in 41, but Josephus knows that in retrospect. And so Caligula, despite having been friends with Herod Agrippa, got a little bit obsessed with the idea of people not worshiping his statue, and so was intending, it seems, to erect a statue of himself in the Jerusalem temple, which may well have provoked a Jewish revolt some 30 years before the revolt actually broke out. So when that revolt did break out, the first Roman-Jewish war that took place between 66 and 74, when that happened, the loyalty of the Alexandrian Jews was questioned. even though that war was taking place in neighboring Judea, not in Alexandria. And so in Alexandria in 66, in the year 66, mobs again massacred members of the city's Jewish community. And now in the next decades, that community started to go into decline as people who weren't massacred started to feel that they weren't safe in the city or welcomed in the city, and they immigrated and moved to other cities and other communities in the empire. And then finally, there was a second Jewish revolt in the year 115 called the diaspora revolt, because it took place in places like Cyrenaica, Egypt, Cyprus, and so on, not so much in Judea itself. And that was fought, in part in Alexandria, where the community was either all killed or expelled. The great synagogue of Alexandria that had stood for a long time was destroyed. And at the end of that revolt, no Jews were left in Alexandria. So there was this community kind of faced very serious decline and then extermination by the 2nd century CE. Okay, so Philo therefore was alive at the beginning of that violent end, because he had lived through the ethnic strife in 38 and 40, but he was already an old man at that point. And that end would happen several generations in the future. But when Philo was born, the Jewish community of Alexandria had thrived and grown for centuries and was very seriously contributing significantly to Jewish thought, and especially to a synthesis between Hellenism and Judaism, since again, Alexandria, with its library, with its museum, was the center for Hellenistic thought for centuries, and here there is a significant Jewish community that is participating in that on its terms. It's actually this Jewish community, the Jews of Alexandria, who were responsible for the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, the translation known as the Septuagint, which is the word for 70. And of course, there's a myth that Ptolemy himself commissioned 70 scholars that created that translation. And that's why it has that name. But in fact, it's actually a work that took place over centuries. And ultimately, the whole corpus of the Hebrew Bible, and even a much more expanded, more books than made it into the rabbinic canon of the Hebrew Bible, were composed into the Septuagint. Greek became the primary language for the Alexandrian Jews, which is one of the reasons they needed the scriptures translated into Greek. And Philo certainly accessed the Hebrew Bible through the Septuagint, and scholars debate the degree to which he knows Hebrew. So he sometimes is able to make etymological discussions about Hebrew terms and things like that, but again, how much he's using Hebrew is debated. So, as you can imagine, being in the heart of Hellenism's great center, Alexandria was a place where there was a Hellenistic Judaism. So it was one of the seats of the Jewish wisdom tradition. It's possible that the 2nd century BCE author Jesus ben Sirach, or Joshua ben Sirach, the author of the book of Sirach, wrote his book in Alexandria. The author of 2nd Maccabees, which defends Hellenism, was likely written by an Alexandrian Jew, and its perspective is in stark contrast to the author of the first book of Maccabees, who was writing in Judea, who is very critical of Hellenism. And so we get two very different pictures of the kind of civil conflict between more Hellenized Jews and Jews that were less Hellenized and wanted to have a stronger border between Greek ideas and traditional ideas within their tradition. There's another book that was roughly contemporary or a little bit earlier than Philo, called Wisdom of Solomon. One of the many books that is attributed to Solomon, not by Solomon, but is actually, again, written by a wisdom author in the Hellenized Jewish population of Alexandria. So Philo was educated in the Hellenistic culture of the city, having read, for example, Greek poets, everyone from Homer to Euripides, and also studied great orators like Demosthenes. And he quotes from all of these. He was heavily influenced by Stoic philosophy, but ultimately his greatest influence is Plato. And so throughout his many works, he quotes from Plato's dialogues, the Timaeus, the Phaedrus, Phaedo, the Republic, the Symposium, the Laws, and many others. His work falls into three general categories. So he writes commentaries on the Pentateuch, the 5 books attributed to Moses, the Torah, but as written in Greek, translated into Greek, the Septuagint. And his commentaries consist of very highly allegorical interpretations of Scripture, in which Philo sees Moses, who he sees as the author of the Pentateuch, as a precursor of Greek philosophers. Philo also wrote philosophical essays that combine Moses, that is to say the Pentateuch text, and Plato. And so the ideas of Plato he reads into his allegorical interpretation of the Pentateuch. And he also pulls ethics, drawing from Stoicism and a little bit of Aristotle's ethics as well, which he, again, reads into the law within the Pentateuch. And then he also writes some apologetic and historical works on behalf of the Jewish community, including, for example, his account of the delegation he had to Rome, and also the account that I quoted from about the troubles leading up to that. So in his first treatise on allegorical interpretation, Philo quotes Genesis chapter 2, where it said, verse 1, where it says, "On the 6th day, God finished his work which he had made," and then he asserts that, quote, "it would be a sign of great simplicity to think that the world was created in 6 days, or indeed at all in time, because all time is only the space of days and nights, and these things the motion of the sun, as he, the sun, passes over the earth and under the earth, does necessarily make. But the sun is a portion of heaven, so one must confess that time is a thing posterior to the world. Therefore, it would be correctly said that the world was not created in time, but that time had its existence in consequence of the world. For it is the motion of heaven that has displayed the nature of time." So you can see here, there's he's absolutely not a young earth creationist who wants to read the Bible literally and said the Bible was made in 6 days. He says that's essentially utter simplicity and utter folly, and instead gives the general understanding of how the world works and cosmos works, and gives, therefore, an interpretation that time itself is something that God created when God began to create the heavens and the earth. So in other words, that God pre-exists before time. So insisting on this, actually eschewing literal readings and insisting on allegorical readings, that's in keeping with contemporary science, that is natural philosophy, and the contemporary natural philosophical understanding of the universe, that was already a well-established practice in Hellenistic philosophy. So Greek philosophers had already been doing this for centuries with their own myths and religion. So as early, for example, as the 6th century before the Common Era, Diogenes of Rhegium argued that the struggle of the gods in Homer, that was just an allegory that is teaching about the opposition between elements, how earth opposes water, which opposes air, and fire, and so forth. These are not these are not literal stories about the gods having a war and egging on a war between Greeks and Trojans, but it's an allegory. Likewise, in the 5th century before the Common Era, Prodicus of Chios reinterpreted the gods as personifications of different substances. And so Demeter, the god of grain, becomes equated with the substance of bread, Dionysius with wine, Poseidon with water, Hephaestus with fire, and so forth. So Philo's allegorical interpretation of the Bible was therefore very much in keeping with the way the Greeks had long been reinterpreting their own mythologies, their own texts. And so, for example, the Stoic philosopher Cleanthes redefines Zeus not as this guy that Hesiod had told all these myths about, who is a human-looking guy who is seducing all these women and doing all these things. No, instead, what he's saying is Zeus is actually the personification of the logos, that rational principle within the Stoic worldview, the God cosmos. Within the God cosmos, the logos, the rational ordering principle, is what could also be called Zeus. So again, that's reinterpreting the gods, and no different from how Philo is doing. So the Stoic view of God as the living universe itself is not easily compatible with the description of God creating the universe in Genesis. So although Philo adapted other ideas from Stoicism, including latching onto that word logos, the contemporary Middle Platonist view of God, in other words, how they interpreted, how they saw God, that proved much more useful to Philo's own monotheism. So Middle Platonism, so-called because it's not immediately what Plato was teaching, and it's not as Plato was reimagined centuries later as Neoplatonism, but this Middle Platonism, which begins at the beginning of the 1st century BC, views God as the idea of ideas, or the form of forms, the one, the archetypical Platonic form, and also views the one as, the fully unmoved mover, the utterly transcendent mover. And so because of how remote and transcendent the one is, in order for us as created beings to have any kind of connection to that, there needs to be an entire host of intermediaries to bridge the gap to the created material world from God. So Philo similarly presents the relationship that God has with creation in a framework that would have been very, very familiar to his Middle Platonist contemporaries. So he says, God, not being urged on by any prompter, for who else could have been there to prompt him, but guided by his own sole will, decided that it was fitting to benefit with unlimited and abundant favors a nature which, without the divine gift, was unable to itself partake of any good thing. But he benefits it, not according to the greatness of his own graces, for they are illimitable and eternal. So he's not limited. I mean, he is, God is unlimited, he's eternal, everything like that. He's doing everything but according to the power of that which is benefited to receive his graces. So creation can only accept so much because it's so limited. For the capacity of that which is created to receive benefits does not correspond to the natural power of God to confer them, since his powers are infinitely greater, and the thing created, being not sufficiently powerful to receive all their greatness, would have sunk under it if he had not measured his bounty, allotting to each in due proportion that which was poured upon it. So God is fully transcendent and superior to creation in Philo's understanding. And Philo also then agrees with the Platonists that God created intellectible models as patterns for creation. That is, God creates the forms first in order to have matter be a shadow of those eternal forms. So Philo writes, if anyone were to desire to use more undisguised terms, he would not call the world, which is perceptible only to the intellect, anything else but the reason of God. So Plato's intellectible world is the reason of God already occupied in the creation of the world. For neither is a city, while only perceptible to the intellect, anything else but the reason of the architect, who is already designing to build one perceptible to external senses on the model of that which is only to the intellect. So just when an architect has a plan in his head of the city that he's about to build, that's the form, and the city only comes into existence because that form exists, so the idea of the forms. So in the architect here, though, is now the forms are in the mind of God. And so Philo says, this is the doctrine of Moses. This is not what I'm saying. Moses is saying this. This is what the Bible says, according to Philo's interpretation of the Bible. Accordingly, he, when recording the creation of man in the words which follow, asserts expressly that he was made in the image of God. And if the image be a part of the image, then manifestly so is the entire form, namely the whole of the world perceptible by the external senses. So the sensible world is simply a imitation. So the world perceptible by the senses is a greater imitation of the divine image than the human form is. So the sensible world is, just like in Platonism, an imitation of the immaterial world in the mind of God. It is manifest also, he says, that the archetypal seal, which we call that world which is perceptible only to the intellect, must itself be the archetypal model, the idea of ideas, the reason of God. So in this way, then, Philo is reasoning upwards that Plato's forms, these immaterial eternal ideas on which the sensible material world of creation is patterned, all of those exist within the idea of ideas, that is to say, God's reason, which we're going to find out is the same as God's logos in Philo's conception. So borrowing from Heraclitus and the Stoics, Philo identifies the first and highest of the intermediaries that exist between the transcendent God and creation, so the lowness of creation and the transcendent God. The first of these intermediaries is God's logos, who is present with God at the creation. So quoting from Genesis 9:6, where it says, "For in the image of God had God made mankind," Philo adds this interpretation. He says, why is it that he speaks as if of some other God, saying that he had made man after the image of God, and not that he had made him after his own image? So it says, in the image of God had God made mankind, instead of saying God made mankind in his own image. So why does he say it that way, Philo asks. Well, very appropriately and without any falsehood was this oracular sentence uttered by God, "For no mortal thing could have been formed on the similitude of the Supreme Father of the universe, but only after the pattern of the second deity, who is the Logos of the Supreme Being." What? Second deity? So anyway, should that trigger alarms here in, I think, when we're talking about Jewish monotheism, right? So since it is fitting that the rational soul of man should bear it the type of the divine Logos, since in his first Logos, God is superior to the most rational possible nature. But he who is superior to the Logos holds rank in a better and more singular preeminence. And how could the creature possibly exhibit a likeness of him in himself? So The supreme father of the universe, the unseeable God, is so transcendent that humans can't simply be made in that God's image, but rather what's happening here is that he's saying that that Father then has something made in his image, which is his logos, his word, and that therefore humans are made in the image of that logos rather than, in other words, through an intermediary, not directly with the Father, which would be impossible because it's just too remote. So in addition to calling the logos the second deity here, made directly in God's image, Philo in other books identifies the logos as God's firstborn. And so he says, and even if there be not as yet anyone who is worthy to be called a son of God, so we humans aren't really worthy to be called son of God, nevertheless, let him labor earnestly to be adorned according to his firstborn logos. The logos, the eldest of his angels, the great archangel of many names. For he, the logos, is called the authority, and the name of God, and the logos, and the man according to God's image, and he who sees Israel. So these are all different ways that Philo understands this very first entity that is the second deity patterned on the unseeable God. For which reason, I was induced a little while ago to praise the principles of those who said, we are all one man's sons. For even if we are not yet suitable to be called sons of God, still we may deserve to be called children of his eternal image, of his most sacred logos, for the image of God is his most ancient logos. So we are patterned after the image of God, which is the logos. So there's the intermediary as opposed to being patterned on God, God's self. So humans should aspire to be worthy to be called sons of God, even if we really can't be. But at least Philo is saying we can rightly be called children of the logos, since humans are made in the image of the logos. Additionally, Philo here calls the logos God's firstborn, and other things like eldest angel, God's authority, God's name. So there's a lot of things that are brought together, a lot of ideas that are brought together by Philo in his interpretation of Scripture and his theology here of understanding the transcendent God and then the intermediary, the first intermediary. So, like I say, although Philo uses many names and analogies to describe the logos, the underlying idea is that there needs to be some kind of an intermediary to connect the fully transcendent, invisible God to the much lower material creation, the sensible universe. So this first intermediary, the logos, forms a second hypostasis, that is to say, an underlying reality or Platonic substance with God as God's rational creative power, God's logos. So Philo sees this second deity as inferior to the transcendent God, and sometimes, like I say, labels the logos an angel or the great archangel. And so this idea that he has diverges from the later Trinitarian ideas that are going to develop a century or so later about the logos. But I'm going to suggest here that while Philo's synthesis of Platonism and Judaism is certainly not Trinitarian, I think we can see that the theological tools needed to develop Christian theology were already present. And so, very soon, decades after Philo is writing, whether or not the authors of the Gospel of John or the author of the Hymn of the Logos had ever read Philo, the ideas were in the same mix that produced that then a couple decades later. And I think we can also see why then Second Temple Judaism, the Hellenized components of Second Temple Judaism, are what Christianity builds on, especially as Christianity becomes a converting religion, which is primarily populated with Greek speakers who are converted from paganism as opposed to being converted from Judaism, because a lot of this synthesis of Plato is it already kind of at present and makes it much more immediately palatable and understandable to all of those new converts. And then finally, I think we can see why rabbinic Judaism goes a different direction, because at the moment when the rabbis are regrouping and trying to reformulate Judaism after the destruction of the temple, so post-temple Judaism, this is the very moment that this long-standing influential community of Hellenized Jews in Alexandria has been totally destroyed. And so this is the reason why Philo is actually remembered and preserved and quoted by the Church Fathers, and his texts are actually preserved in Christian libraries rather than the rabbinic libraries. Although, it's been refound by more recent Judaism, of course, and is a great understanding for Judaism in general and understanding the diversity of thought in this time period. And so that is my take on Philo and the Logos. So I want to thank people for their support. Thanks to CK, to JM, to Dartharama, to Kevin Thompson, to Dave Anderson, to Mark Long, to Fire Ever Living, to Magi Mike. Appreciate it all. Thank you for supporting the lectures. Julie Bazuski asks, I think the best biblical description of the Logos, aside from John, or at least to hint at it, may be from Psalm 33, which says in verses 6 and 7, the Lord spoke, and the heavens were created. He breathed the word. So that's interesting to do that. So this is, Landro has written to me that this is from the New Revised Standard Version. And so the word here means, the Hebrew is bidbar, meaning word or oracle or counsel of the Lord. And so the Lord of the heavens made all the hosts of the breath of his mouth. He gathered the waters of the sea as a bottle. He puts the deep in storehouses. So it's interesting. I'll have to look at that, Julie, for we keep on talking about whether we need to do a lecture on the Psalms, and I'm actually wanting to buy a few more commentaries of the Psalms so that I have more detail to give in such a lecture, because I want to look into all of this. Lander, can you raise up the... I'm at Todd Radmaker. So Todd Radmaker says, who wrote the Logos hymn? We don't know the author of any of the names of any of the authors of the Gospel of John. So there are multiple authors who composed John, and so there is the Logos hymn might have been a Christian hymn that predates it, or it might have been something that there are different component sources. So there's thought to be the sign source, and maybe also the passion source, or maybe there was one sign passion source, and then there's a significant expansion by one of the authors who we might think of as the main author of John, who would have written around that and expanded that, and then there's a final editor that will have written little extra bits and edits, but none of those are known. We've had a lecture on who wrote the Gospel of John before. K. Dempus Bradford, is there music to the hymn at the beginning of John, either from antiquity or contemporary? I'm not aware of there being any of that being set to music. Yeah, certainly not from antiquity, but I mean, I'm not aware of a contemporary one. So they wouldn't have had, they wouldn't have had the kind of tunes that we have back in antiquity. That's not how music was done. So poetry would have been read in kind of more like a rhythmic way, as opposed to a melodic hymn like we have music that we have today. Winston Barquez says, how did the logos of the Stoics contribute to the theistic concepts of fine-tuning of the universe and intelligent design? So I think that the way it works in the Stoic conception is that we're aware that a lot of the material world, when we're seeing the material world as all one big cosmic entity, nevertheless it has parts within it that are simply rocks and stuff, and so those are not particularly active and showing signs of divinity. And so I think the idea of the logos within the world soul is that this represents the part that is keeping everything fine-tuned and intelligent and working, and why everything is active and cycles through, and there is new creation happening along with all the destruction that happens. And so I think that that's probably it's understanding that active principle that is keeping the universe kind of living, that is where the Stoic idea is happening there. Horace Aurelian says, did the exodus of pantomime actors in 23 CE influence gospel playwrights? So I don't know what you mean by an exodus of pantomime actors and gospel playwrights. So I think that I'm probably telling a joke that I'm missing here, Aries, but the Gospels aren't from that time, and the writers aren't playwrights. Alan Troy asks, what's the difference between Philo's imitation and the current idea of simulation? So I'm also not sure what you mean by Philo's imitation or the current idea of simulation, Alan, so I'm not sure.
I think you were talking about simulation before, or maybe that's something that people were talking about in the chat.
Maybe people were talking about simulation in the chat, but I don't know. So if you're talking about the idea of, if I don't know I would be speculating wildly here if you're talking about like what we're all being in the Matrix. In other words, the universe is just a simulation or something. That's I would say that's not the sense of Platonism. The Platonism is, I guess, the similarity between, let's say, that we're all in the Matrix is that the Matrix is, there's a material world that's underlying that, and everybody is in a fake simulation. The Platonism reverses that, because the material world itself is matter and everything like that. We're all radical materialists, so we think that only the material world matters. And Plato is arguing, no, doesn't matter at all. It's the eternal world of the ideas that is the only thing that's really real. So it'd be the opposite. Mesology Media says, could it be fair to say that these philosophers were creating the basis for simulation theory, since it's the idea about the immaterial logos word concept being the basis of reality? And so, yeah, I think that you guys must probably having this in the lecture. And so what I would say is that that in some ways it's sort of the opposite of it, but maybe we're having this again because we have had this entire modern era. We have been very focused on materialism, and matter is the only thing that matters. And so now that we have started creating, this world where our lives are lived on screens and everything is a virtual reality, now we're having that's influencing how we're understanding things. But in some ways, again, philosophically, this is the opposite idea. So the argument from the Platonists, including like Philo here, is that the material world exists and it consists of matter, but that matter doesn't matter, because what's real and true is the thing that won't perish, the eternal ideas and being one with God. Fire Ever Living says, are there any Jewish groups that have taken up Philo's philosophy again without becoming Messianic Jews? I doubt it. I don't know that, but it would be interesting. I would think that Messianic Jews may well, read and recover Philo, but I don't actually know. So I haven't had a lot of contact with Messianic Jews, and none of the I've never had any discussions with anybody in Reform Judaism about Philo, so I'm not sure if there has been any kind of rebirth of that in a religious sense within any component of Judaism. Zoper Explex says, what was the reaction of first century Judaism towards Philo? So he was considered an incredible leader. He was well known as a learned writer. We saw what Josephus had to say about him, which is that he was eminent and respected by everybody in the community. And so I think these ideas were fully in keeping with what Hellenized Judaism was interested in, Greek-speaking Judaism in the Jewish community in Alexandria. That said, there would have been the other community that was trying to reject a lot of Hellenism. And so this is why we talked about how there's competing books of Maccabees where some traditionalists are wanting to keep more. Everybody's been Hellenized to some extent or another, but they're trying to keep more of the Greek ideas out of their religion and draw a cordon around it. And so there is a debate within Second Temple Judaism, and some folks don't see Hellenism as a threat at all. They see it as completely compatible, like Philo does. But there's not only one idea. So some people very much would have had it would have appealed to them, but others would have resented it. So the N.A. Works says, do you think Christianity would have Hellenized without Philo, or was that more of a foregone conclusion? So it was already part of the Hellenistic Jewish tradition. I would say that we don't even have any of the early Christian writings in Aramaic or any of the language that Jesus was speaking. We have it all recorded first in Greek, and again, our earliest Christian whose writings survive, Paul, is writing in Greek. So Christianity was already part of the Hellenized Jewish branch of Second Temple Judaism, and so what I think Philo here is not a person who created Christianity, or you have to have had him in order for Christianity to exist, but rather he is an incredible example of the ideas and philosophical tools that were existing within Hellenized Judaism, and so which is the part of Judaism that Christianity grows out of. K. Tempest Bradford says, do I have a recommendation for good translations of Philo? Unfortunately, I don't, because I have my own ones are not very good. So I have a big book that is like his complete works, but it is one of these ones that has been republished in old translation, and also the ones that I was using an internet source so I could have the text online. And again, it's a very old translation, and so I frankly need to have a new, maybe he wrote a lot, so it's hard to have a whole library of everything that he has. So a lot of Philo has been preserved. But if we had if I had some of the best works, let's say annotated, that's what I would really like to have. And unfortunately, I don't have a recommendation for that. Oh, Michael Karpowitz asks, are there novel ideas in Philo's thought that have influenced your own thinking about religion? So one of the things that both Philo and when we look closely at early Christian thought, I think one of the things that these have both done to influence me is this awareness that early Christians, and also people in Second Temple Judaism, in Philo here, has a much higher Christology if we just think of his idea of the logos, it's not really Christology because he's not Christian, but there's a much higher idea of, this conception of logos than modern day Christians. I think modern day Christians have gotten so fixated on Christ as Jesus and Jesus as a historical figure and focused on the historicity of Jesus that everybody has become, pretty much everybody's become heretics, that nobody anymore thinks of Christ as God. They have this kind of very human way of thinking about Jesus which they're dubious of. And so for me, what the influence that all of this has had on me is kind of trying to recover that high Christology and to, if possible, fully separate historicity and the ideas of the historical Jesus from, my thinking about Christ, so that we can again recover, an understanding of Christ as God. Matilda Huisman, thank you for your support. Fire Ever Living says, if you interpret the New Testament very liberally, perhaps all of these different conceptions of logos can lead to salvation, and the point is to just look toward transcendence, i.e., follow the logos to the transcendent source. And so, Fire Ever Living, that's a great comment and way to look at it, I think. So yes. Is that it, Leandro, or are we? Okay. Well, thank you so much for all of this. I want to remind everybody that we won't have a lecture next week, but the week after that, we'll look at female apostles in the early church, and then we're going to go after the Trinity. Thanks again.